Good morning. As we were in Bible class this morning here in the auditorium, I kind of alluded to the theme a little bit in regard to the topic that I was going to talk about today, and in regard to shared responsibilities and how each of us share in our responsibilities equally, that not just the teachers or Bible class teachers are responsible for the outcome in a Bible class, but that both do, and that would be the case with many and all, for the most part, of our responsibilities as Christians, that we equally bear responsibility and are accountable ourselves for what we do or do not do. Last week, John Bob kind of gave me the idea. It was an old idea I had for a sermon topic, and when he mentioned something last week about being apt to teach, I went ahead and went with that. And I want to talk about qualifications today. Sometimes we are familiar with and we talk about qualifications, and we talk about them from a unique perspective, I think sometimes. And we don't always realize that qualifications apply to you and I as well, and not just specific individuals. I titled this lesson, for lack of a better idea, Am I Qualified to be a Christian? Now, what I'm really saying is, am I doing everything that would qualify me for salvation? Am I upholding to my responsibilities as an individual? Am I doing my part? The question I should ask myself is, am I relying on somebody else? Far too often, I think sometimes brethren get hung up on what others are doing, what others are not doing. In that respect, often we see the shortcomings of others very clearly, but yet we have a little bit more poor vision when we're looking in the mirror. That we do not always look at ourselves, judge ourselves the way that we should, and the way that the Bible expects us to. When we do this, we do this sometimes when we're looking around the local church, and we take note of who's not doing what I'm doing. Brother so-and-so or brother sister, they don't do what I do. And we have a tendency to judge ourselves that way sometimes. And I did mention a little bit of this morning, but what we're actually doing when we do this is we're comparing ourselves to others instead of to the pattern. And unfortunately, that misleads us sometimes. We will elevate ourselves sometimes by looking for the failures in our brethren, rather than looking at ourselves and comparing it to the actual pattern. Some people, and I did repeat this morning in the Bible class, but I've taught class for 20 years. I've done my part. However, so-and-so is not teaching. Well, so-and-so ought to be teaching. We talked about teaching a lot this morning. But that doesn't mean that I've done my part, that I can retire as a Christian, and I can stop growing, and I can stop helping the church grow, and I can stop being a part of the growth or a part of the reason that a church would grow. And quite obviously is if I'm not doing that part, then I could be part of the reason why it's not growing or actually shrinking. Some people say, well, I do all these specific good deeds, and I don't see other people doing these good deeds. Once again, I'm comparing myself to what I perceive as the failures of somebody else. The preacher doesn't preach this topic enough. Well, do we teach it when we have the opportunity? Do we take the opportunity to teach when we have it? Most of us are given multiple opportunities throughout a week to do a little bit of teaching, and sometimes to get really involved. A thought I had this morning was, what happens when we miss the opportunity to teach somebody due to our lack of being capable or our fear or whatever it might be, and I miss the opportunity to convert somebody that I dearly care about, that I really would like to see them answer the call of the gospel, and I miss my shot at it because of whatever the reasons are. When we start talking about qualifications, most of the time we start thinking of elders and deacons. And I think that's a good place to start, because I think there's a lot to compare in regard to the qualifications of elders and deacons to the individual Christian. And that's kind of how we're going to approach the lesson today. I could continue with example after example, but the bottom line is when we compare other people by the standard and then we compare ourselves by other people, we're missing the mark. We need and seemingly forget that we too are subject to the same standard, the same qualifications for the most part. In 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, it says, "For we dare not make ourselves of the number or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves. But they, by measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise." We all know where wisdom comes from. The book of Proverbs gives us plenty of example of the meaning, the purpose, and how to acquire wisdom. So it's not from looking at everybody else and then elevating ourselves by what they do or don't do. When looking at ourselves or others, we're still to use the same standard. When I look at my brother or I look in the mirror, the standard is the same. To judge righteously means that we must ourselves be striving to live accordingly to the pattern that has been given to us in the New Testament law, and then encourage others to do the same. Comparison of the qualifications of elders to every other Christian, like I said, I think is an interesting thing to talk about, because with the exception of a couple of those qualifications, the majority of them apply to each and every one of us. There are unique qualifications, and it's true, there's responsibilities that Christian men have that are theirs alone. There's responsibilities that women have. There are responsibilities that elders and deacons must meet, or qualifications that they must meet in order to qualify, that are unique to that position, being married, having children. But when you start looking through in Titus and Timothy at the qualifications, the majority of those apply to each and every one of us. And unfortunately, over the decades, so many congregations don't have church elders or deacons because they hold that standard as if it were something that was unattainable, as if it was something that no one could meet. Sometimes they do that because if I can't meet it, then I don't have to do that work. I don't have to desire that work. Unfortunately, we hurt the church and we don't realize that we're holding them to a standard higher than what they should be held to. It's not impossible to have these qualities. In fact, it's required of all of us for the most part. Like I said, there are a couple of qualifications that are unique to the office or the positions. But I thought we would look at a few. There's no way to look at all of them in the time that we have. But just do some general comparisons. I mentioned once before that, the husband of one wife, is one of the few qualifications that elders and deacons have to have. They've got to be married. We talked about having children. But having, a wife or having children is not one of those things that every person has to have. They're good things. They're valuable things. I think most of us would agree to that. But it's not a requirement. But it is for those that are mature, that are going to be selected to lead. But when you get away from these, and we'll just grab some of them randomly. Let's see. I looked at 1 Timothy 3, verse 2, took a few out of there, a couple out of Titus, and I knew I would run out of time. But it says, "A bishop, therefore," and I'll read this. This is 1 Timothy 3, verse 2. It says, "Therefore the bishop must be without reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, orderly, given to hospitality, apt to teach, no brawler, no striker, but gentle, not contentious, no lover of money, one that ruleth his own house well, having his children in subjection with all gravity. But if a man knoweth not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up he fall into condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony from them that are without, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil." That's a pretty lengthy list by itself. You get the same list with some different terms in Titus, But let's look at a couple of things here. Without reproach. That was one of the first things that was mentioned there. Without reproach. That means without blame, discredit, or disgrace. Not saying every Christian is going to be sinless, blameless 100% of the time. But we all have the requirement to be that way, to strive to be that way, and to work towards that. In Philippians 2:15, it says that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world. It's quite obvious that not just the elders have to be blameless, that each of us have a responsibility, and we can, probably most of us can quote verses that say just that. We have to be a light in the world, an example. And we'll get into good reputation because a lot of these tie together, but we have to be that. You and I as a people have to be that. You and I as individuals have to live up to this expectation. It is certainly the qualification of an elder, but it is also what every mature Christian should be. We should be growing to that point. In 2 Peter 3 and verse 14 it says, "Wherefore, beloved, seeing that you look for such things, be diligent that you may be found of him in peace, without spot and blameless." That's just two places that says that any Christian needs to be and have this characteristic. We call it a qualification because we're using it to choose men to serve in an office. But it's not something that I can excuse myself from and only apply to an elder or deacon. When I start looking at qualifications, I need to remember, and we talked about this earlier this morning, about being good students and digging and looking and realizing that this is not some high expectation that's only expected of elders, it's expected of all of us. It's not just an elder or deacon that must exhibit this quality. This is a quality of a Christian. It's an individual Christian's responsibility to walk without shame. It does not mean perfection, as I said, or without guilt, but it does mean walking in the light. It does mean making wrongs right. It does mean turning around when I make a mistake. Not excusing myself because, well, I'm not one of those guys that hold a position. You know, we all are accountable for ourselves. Not to bring reproach against the church. By being blameless, we're going to accomplish that requirement. Yes, it's necessary for all of us. There's the word temperate. Temperate means to exercise self-control. Certainly, that is an important quality for any leader. That is an important quality for elders. That's an important quality for deacons. That's an important quality for a Christian. Because we are leading in the sense that we're supposed to be lights of the world. We are the Bible that some people see. It's how we live and how we behave that might draw somebody to or turn somebody against God. So let's think about that just a minute. 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 25, it says, "And every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible crown." Many of the qualifications of elders and deacons are similar, just as the fruits of the Spirit are similar. If we look at the places where they're listed, a lot of those individually listed items are quite similar to another one. And that's true with the qualifications for certain traits that we must have. And I say we, and that is inclusive to all of us. And you'll see throughout this study that they are the traits that are required of both you and I as individuals. And they just happen to be the traits of a mature Christian, and that's whom we would select our leaders from and those that would serve. In 2 Titus 2 and 2, we learned that an elder is supposed to be sober-minded. While it's a qualification for an elder, it is certainly a qualification for mature men. Titus 2 and 2 says that the aged men be sober, grave. Note he says temperate, sound in faith, in charity, and in patience. You're going to hear some of those terms again as we go through this lesson. And like I said, I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but This wasn't written in 1 Timothy chapter 3. It wasn't written in Titus 1. This was written in chapter 2. It was written to the old aged men, the mature men. They have a responsibility to, guess what? Be mature Christians. And that's what this comes down to. In Titus 2 and 6, we'll find that this is also required of the young men. It's not just for the old guys. It's for you young fellows. Young men likewise exhort to be sober-minded. You see, this applies to young men, to old men, to the elders. It applies to the elder's wife. In 1 Timothy 3 and verse 11, it says, even so their wives must be grave, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things, exercising self-control. In 1 Timothy chapter 2 and in Titus chapter 2 verse 4, it says that the young women, they may teach the young women to be sober. He's talking about the older women teaching the younger women. And what are they teaching them? To be sober-minded. They're teaching them to be sober-minded, to love their husbands and to love their children. To be sober, to be wise. There's a word in there that most of us know the meaning of, and we sometimes just think about it, but the word orderly. Conform to order, observant of one another, of authority or rule. One who walks in a lawful way, one who is observant of the rules or the ordinances, which would include the laws and ordinances of God, who conducts himself in an orderly fashion. And we find that that is important in 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 10 when it says all things must be done decently in order. Who's responsible for that? All of us. I mean, I understand that there's a responsibility that bears on the elders to make determinations about things, but we are the ones that actually maintain order as a whole. Because we do that by maintaining ourselves in an orderly fashion, and then that just amplifies from one member to one member to one member. And when we have a worship service, we do it in an orderly fashion that requires all of us. If people ignored the law of order, there would be side conversations going on, disrespect. There's no telling where it could go. In fact, we can see the results of these kind of things when we look outside of the church and in other places. So let's just keep that in mind. In Colossians 2 and verse 5, it says, for though I be absent in the flesh, yet am I with you in the spirit, joying and beholding your order and the steadfastness of your faith. All Christians are to conduct themselves in an orderly fashion. When they are going about their daily lives, when they're engaging in the work of the church and worship, the responsibility or qualification is not simply limited to elders. Given the hospitality, it's another qualification that an elder must have. However, biblically speaking, when we're talking about hospitality, we're talking about the treating of both people we know as well as strangers. It's friends alike, welcoming one another into our homes and into our lives. Hospitality is a devout duty. It's a responsibility of Christians of all ages. And I'm obviously not necessarily talking about children, but I'm talking about us Christians. We need to understand that we have a responsibility towards that. It is a responsibility for the elders, the deacons, for the preacher, and every member of the church to be hospitable. Romans 12 and verse 2 says, be kindly affectioned one to another, with brotherly love, in honor, preferring one another, not slothful in business, fervent in the spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in the hope, patience in tribulation, continuing instant in prayer, distributing to the necessity of the saints, and giving to hospitality. And he's talking to you and me in this here verse. Also in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 9, it says, use hospitality one to another without grudging. This is especially important among Christians. And while I stated earlier it is to all, But it's especially important that we treat one another this way, that we have this general care and concern for one another, this love for one another, and this willingness to be one with one another. Notice that Paul and Peter both say that this is how we're to treat one another. So that wasn't just my opinion here. That's what Paul and Peter, both two apostles, said, how we're to be perceived by others. People need to see me as being hospitable. They need to see you as being hospitable. They need to see that character trait because it is a fruit of the Spirit. How we behave is what other people see on a daily basis, not just on Sunday mornings or Sunday evenings. Who we are is how we live, and this is one of the ways that we as Christians must live. We can't simply just proclaim it. We can't be picky and choosy. It's easy to invite your buddies over to visit. It's easy to spend time with someone that you've got a lot in common with. We have to make those things happen in the church. We have to work towards getting to know one another. We've talked about that a whole lot in the Sunday morning class over the last couple of months. Sean mentioned that one time in his sermon about taking the opportunity to be somebody else's blessing. I think was one of the bullets on his, and it caught my mind because it fit with what we were talking about that morning in class. We have to take the opportunity as Christians to do good things to one another. We have to take that opportunity, and your imagination is your limit as far as the good things we can do for each other. We don't have to, we're really good, I think, in this congregation about trying to help people that are in need. But it doesn't have to be that. It can just be just because you're my brother, and maybe I open a door of opportunity. I get to know you just a little bit better because I decided to do something good for you, something small even, and vice versa. It's everybody doing that, and all of a sudden, we're not just hospitable individuals. We become a hospitable people in this place. We become the type of people that we're reading about in these scriptures. Apt to teach. John Bob said last week in Sunday class, Sunday morning Bible class, that apt to teach means being able to teach. Is that what you said, John Bob? Yes, sir. Being able to teach. Being fit, adapted, or qualified to teach. And I don't think there's anybody that would expect less of our elders or even our deacons. We would expect that out of them. The point that I want to make is that expectation belongs to each and every one of us. That requirement belongs to each and every one of us. That quality as a Christian belongs to each and every one of us because the responsibility to fulfill the Great Commission is in our individual abilities to teach. I may not travel across to Africa and teach, but if I'm not doing it here, if I'm not taking advantages of the opportunities here, if I'm not stepping up with the work in my private life, if I'm not stepping up and doing that, then I'm not fulfilling an obligation that, yes, even the regular Christian has. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 24 through 26 says, "And the servant of the Lord," who is that? That's us. "And the servant of the Lord must not strive, but must be gentle unto all men, apt to teach, patient." Verse 25 says, "In meekness, instructing those that oppose themselves. If God, peradventure, will give them repentance to the acknowledging of the truth, and that they may recover themselves out of the snare of the devil, who are taken captive by him at his will." The reason that all of us are required to be capable of teaching, and I don't want to put a period behind capable, we have to be capable, we have to be willing, and we have to be doing. The reason that we're behind this is because our membership needs to grow, not just in number, but in strength, in ability, in maturity. We must become strong. That's why we have to have the ability to teach one another. There are some people that might need to be saved, and you or I might be their one opportunity. We might be the one chance that the door was cracked just a little bit, and we let it pass. And we will own that. So we need to be prepared. We need to be ready and take advantage. And I think Sean makes a good point from time to time that sometimes it's just a little comment. You know, they give you a little comment about a situation in their life or whatever, and you give them a little reassurance from God's Word. You give them a little invite. It's more than just saying, hey, why don't you come to church with me? It's about making that a real invitation. It's about starting maybe with the first opportunity that we get. Something going on in their life or their situation, it gives you an opportunity to let them know what the Lord has said about that situation or that circumstance. And to do it with love, do it with care, be bold, but yet gentle. We can't afford to put off this responsibility to someone else. We, as individuals, just as the elders, will be held accountable for growth in ourselves, in our brethren, and to those outside the Lord. We're all accountable for that work, for that responsibility. Another interesting one, and sometimes I look at these qualifications and I'm like, they're no-brainers. And really, most of them are. One of the ones is no brawler. A brawler here in the King James Version means to quarrel noisily and indecently, to speak loud or roar indecently. You kind of get the picture. Could be someone who's even willing to go to blows, but it doesn't have to go to that point before we recognize what a brawler is. You know, we recognize that in our society and have seen it. That is something we cannot afford to be as individuals. No strife, or to cause strife, is one of the things that this means. It's certainly not becoming of an elder or a deacon or a preacher, and it's not becoming of anyone who wears the name Christian. In 2 Timothy 2:24, we read this just a moment ago, and it says that the servant of the Lord must not strive. And then it also says the opposite of that, must be gentle. A brawler is not gentle. A brawler is reactive in a very bad way and a very visible way. And sometimes we see it in people, and sometimes we see it in people that wear the name Christian. We all have the responsibility to live up to that expectation of avoiding this characteristic. Galatians 5:19 says, now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanliness, lasciviousness. Verse 20 says idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, and that's what the brawler causes, seditions, and heresies. But no striker, but gentle. There's that contrasting traits there. Not a striker, but gentle. That's the way we have to behave. I know that's hard sometimes. I think we can avoid being a brawler. But understanding how to be gentle in conflict is something that probably all of us could use a little growth on. You know, the majority of us need to understand and strengthen and embrace that attitude of gentleness, because it comes into play when we're teaching. It not only comes into place of conflict or bad situations, but you know, you're teaching somebody with a different idea, a different background, a different thought, a different religion. If you just jump in there and tell them how wrong they are and they need to get their act together and do what I believe, that's not going to work. We've got to be able to deliver truth boldly and yet gently when it's necessary. Now, there's a time for firmness. I think we recognize that. We've seen that example even in Christ. There's a time, but we've got to have the self-control and the wisdom to know when and how to deliver any reaction to any situation. A striker. I mentioned that in the tail end of that verse because that often is the results of the brawler, or that's where it leads to. And I think that's another self-explanatory one. That's the brawler on steroids, because he's willing to go to blows. And certainly, there's not a one of you that disagree that an elder shouldn't be that way, or a deacon shouldn't behave that way. I don't think we have any problem. I shouldn't be that way if I'm a Christian. I have to have the kind of self-control that I don't ever even get close to being that way. In Galatians 5, verse 21, it says, and these are obviously not fruits of the Spirit that I'm going to be reading here, but rather things of the flesh: envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings. And I always put in bold the word such like. And we've talked about that many times. And such like, of which I tell you before, as I've also told you in the past, that they which do these things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Many times we've talked about up here to this crowd that we have a list of behaviors that are not becoming of any Christian. It's not an exhaustive list. The Bible tells us anything like that, anything similar to that. And we're given enough wisdom to discern the difference. We're given various lists of fruits of the Spirit, and we're given various lists of fruits of the flesh. We don't have any and should not have any trouble determining the difference, and we need to remember that we're responsible for bearing the fruit of the Spirit and wearing the fruit of the Spirit. No lover of money. Interesting, they put that down as a qualification of an elder, isn't it? No lover of money. We can see the responsibility of that. Anybody that's responsible for the money, the spending, there's always an opportunity for someone to be corrupt. There's always that opportunity. And you certainly do not want in leadership someone that is corrupt. We've seen it in the business world. We've seen it in some churches in times past, and even in the denominational world in times past. That is a horrible thing. And it's an important thing to recognize in your leaders as one that does not have this trait. But how does it apply to you and I as individual Christians? I think we all know the answer to this one. I don't think that we would have much trouble understanding that this applies to all of us, because there's one verse at least that was quoted so many times we know it by heart. But the lover of money exhibits many sins, and it leads to all kinds of things, from greed and coveting and ill-gotten gain. And you could go along an entire list of things that one who loves money could get himself involved in that would be sinful. Titus 1:11 says, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things that they ought not to, for filthy lucre's sake. There are those in the world that have basically developed new variations of religion and made themselves wealthy. They disregard truth because it has filled their pocketbook. They have figured out a way to skillfully and artfully convince a crowd of people that they are serving the Lord, and these individuals have gotten rich. And there's names that we've known all our lives in the denominational world that are millionaires because they could skillfully articulate the emotions of people and bring in the bucks. And guess what? Truth doesn't matter to them because they have that greed. They are guilty of filthy lucre. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 2, it says, feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre's sake, but of a ready mind. We have a responsibility to feed the flock, to nourish them spiritually. To some degree, that requires money. We understand how the money is acquired. It's free will offering. It's an obligation of the individual Christians. it gets collectively put together into a treasury, for lack of a better term, and then it's used for the Word. And there's a responsibility to use that with wisdom, as those that are in charge of that, such as elders, to be good stewards, to make sure that it is spent properly for the right reasons, for the right purpose. But you guys, me guys, individuals, we have to be on the lookout. We have to be aware. How many congregations have been led into bad situations due to the greed or misuse of money by their leadership because they were unaware? So it's a responsibility for all of us to have this trait, to understand this responsibility, and to understand the responsibility in regard to our leadership. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 10, the verse that we're all familiar with, and that's the love of money. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves with many sorrows. Any Christian can get caught up in the pursuit of wealth. Any Christian could find themselves hindered by greed. The love of money can be a problem for an elder, for a deacon, any brethren, any brother, any sister. And none of us are supposed to love money to the point that we would cheat, that we would covet, that we would steal, mislead, misuse, misguide, whatever it might be. Whether it's in the church, whether it's in regard to our neighbor, whether it's in regard to our debts, whatever it might be, we all have to have that quality to avoid that trait of having a love for money, for loving wealth greater than one another, for loving wealth greater than the church, for loving our wealth even greater than the Lord, that we choose and do things accordingly. I told myself I wasn't going to say this, but I put it in my notes. Patience is a virtue. When I hear that, I think of Yoda. Just one of the famous lines in the old Star Wars movie, but it couldn't be a truer statement. Patience is a virtue that all of us must have. It will help us endure trials. It helps us if we're watching expectantly. Forbearance, endurance, it's the ability to tolerate delay, trouble, suffering without reacting in anger or hurt. It's a quality that overturns haste, and avoids mistakes. Patience might be, for some of us, one of our most difficult goals to achieve. Whether it's in the world of work, whether it's raising our children, or trying to be an example to our grandchildren, dealing with our spouses, or them dealing with us, patience is a powerful skill that must be mastered by Christians because it affects everyone around us, including ourselves. Romans 15 and verse 4 says, so whoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, in what we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. That's probably one of the most important things, is the person who acquires patience can keep focused on that hope, to keep focused on that goal. In 1 Timothy 6 and 11 it says, be thou, O man of God, flee these things and follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and meekness. One of the strongest characteristics that any elder could have would be patience. One of the strongest characteristics that any Christian can have is patience. We all try one another. We all struggle. We all run into all the bumps. We rub each other wrong. We say the things wrong. We don't clarify. We run into these things. And if we don't have patience, then we lose ground. Sometimes it's the opportunity to convert. Sometimes it's opportunity to avoid a situation before it occurs. And brethren, I'm as guilty of that as anybody. I struggle with patience. And I think the older I get, sometimes the more difficult it gets to be. And maybe that's because life throws more at us. Because we do have kids, we do have grandkids, we do have bills and mortgages, and I just think as responsibility continues, our need for patience is much more. And when we live in this world and we work with people in this world, we need patience, and we need to work on that. That is a very important goal that we have. Titus 3, or 2 Timothy 3 and verse 10 says, "But thou hast fully known my doctrine, manner of life, purpose, faith, long-suffering, charity, patience." It's just listed over and over again in the Scriptures, Titus 2 and 2, that the aged men be sober, grave, temperate, sound in the faith, and charity and in patience. And notice that charity and patience are listed pretty close to each other a couple of times. Sometimes it's that love. It's the only thing that gives us the strength to have the patience. So they build on each other. All of these traits prop each other up to become a mature Christian. And as a mature Christian, certainly that's going to make many of us, men in particular, it's going to make us qualified to serve by embracing the qualities that we're supposed to have already. And the church needs leadership. All over the world, there's congregations, and even in our communities, there's congregations that don't have leadership. And it's because we haven't embraced the qualities and the responsibility that goes with those qualities to grow ourselves and then commend ourselves to step in and fulfill shoes that are needed to be filled in many places. These are very important traits for our elders, for our deacons, but they're especially important for the entire brotherhood. And that's what we need to remember. Hebrews 6 and 12 says, "Be not slothful, but followers of them that who through faith and patience inherit the promise." It takes a little faith to get along the way. We're getting close to the end of our time, and I mentioned earlier that there was no way that I could get through all of the qualifications and talk about them. But when you look at the qualifications of being an elder or being a deacon, if you look at the qualities that are required of a teacher, and then you go back and you look at the lists that are provided that are considered fruits of the Spirit, and look at how many of this stuff applies to every single one of us. Every single one of us can grow. And I'm going to go back and mention something that Scott Sharp said in class. When I mentioned earlier about apt to teach, and we got to talking about the different grounds. You've got the thorny ground and you got the fertile ground. And Scott made a point that not only do we have to pay attention to where we're planting the seed and understand that the results will vary, but Scott made an excellent point. You and I have a responsibility to be the right kind of ground. And I know that's a little off topic, but when you add it back to it, it's just one of the qualities that we have to have. We have to be the right kind of students. We have to have the right kind of attitudes so that as we want to grow, we receive the nourishment, the Word, we study our Bibles, we compare, we qualify what's being taught to what's actually in the Scriptures, and therefore we become fertile ground and we grow without even knowing it sometimes. I'm going to conclude because of the time. But of all the seemingly stringent qualifications for elders or even deacons, there are only a couple, as I said earlier, that apply to just those offices. The other qualifications, and there's some that we didn't have time to cover, like ruling your house well, these apply to all of us. We have a responsibility as parents. We have a responsibility as mothers. We have a responsibility in that part. We could go on and on. We're given plenty of instructions regarding a man's role in the home, not giving to wine, being quick-tempered. All of these things, they apply to all of us. And we need to look at all of the things that God says about these things. Study the words. Sometimes there's similar words with similar meanings. And understand these qualities apply to all of us. Failure to live up to these expectations means, regretfully, that I'm failing as a Christian if I'm not striving to live up to these expectations. Those are tough words. They're tough words because it really doesn't matter if I say it. It doesn't matter if you say it to me. God has already told us the traits and the characteristics, the attitudes, the behaviors, the caring, the parallel singleness of mind that we're all to have in both the work and our caring for each other. And we're going to be individually held accountable for that, every one of us. And so we have to look in the mirror, I'm going to say with clearer vision than when I'm looking at Greg or when I'm looking at Kurt. I need to be looking at Andrew with a lot more clarity, because guess who is ultimately accountable for Andrew? And that's the attitude we got to have about that. Brethren, before any of this matters, a person's got to be a part of the family of God. A person's got to take the first step. You can't be the most mature Christian until you've taken that first step and become one. You can't be a complete individual that's pleasing to God until first you admit and understand that Jesus came to this world, that He died, and He did it because I'm a sinner. He did it because I didn't deserve it, and there's no way I could make up for it. He did it out of a love that I can't even fathom. With all the writing about it and all the understanding, why would He do it for a world that cares nothing about Him? But He requires something of us. He requires us to submit to Him. He requires us to turn away from the lifestyles that we had been living or have been living and purpose ourselves as servants of Christ. To submit ourselves in baptism, being buried in the watery grave of baptism as Christ was buried in that tomb, to be raising up out of that water, the new man, as the Scriptures tells us, as Christ was raised out of that tomb to live again. And symbolically, we live again because we're living a different lifestyle from that day forward. Then we start working. That's when we work on it. But we've got to take the first step. And if you're not a Christian today, if you've not submitted yourself to Christ in baptism as is commanded multiple times in the Scriptures, as we have multiple examples, if we haven't taken that simple step, and there's people that say, well, what's the big deal about that water back here? It's just water. You're right. It is just water. There's nothing about that water that'll save you. But your submission to Christ, you're submitting yourself by being buried in that water and being raised up, will have your sins removed, not by that water, but by the power of God. You will be cleansed by your faith because of the grace of Jesus. That's how it works. And then we just begin the journey of becoming a mature Christian. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, I encourage you to do so. We encourage you to embrace Christ, submit to Him, be buried in the watery grave of baptism, and start living, growing, and encouraging the people around you. Teaching them. Because you might be sitting here today, not a Christian, and you might be the one opportunity that somebody else has. You might be the one that convinces somebody else to consider their soul and to look at God's Word and figure out what they need to do about it. You could be that one. You could be that one that makes the angels rejoice. And if you are Christian and you've not been living as you should, the Bible teaches us that a Christian that's not living as we should, we have the privilege of turning to God and asking Him for forgiveness and making it right once more. Because on that journey, from the time we're baptized until the time we die, we run into difficult roads. We trip, we fall, we make mistakes, we lose a little bit of the self-control, or we haven't mastered it yet and we're working on it. We're going to mess up sometimes. But a Christian can turn to God in prayer and ask for forgiveness. And we're willing to assist with that, assist you at becoming a Christian today or making things right with God. If you're willing, we ask you to come forward while we stand and while we sing.